Ladies and gentlemen, I am here this evening not only to state the obvious, which is that life is, yes, often complicated, but to warn you against the manipulations of your political overlords, those who want your vote, your money, and most importantly, your identity. Those who construct easy compartments for you to slip into unthinkingly, flattering your egos, stoking your furies. I am here to argue that you have a duty, aesthetic, political, intellectual, and above all moral, to maintain a political homelessness, or as a very impolitic friend back home in LA recently put it, to remain politically unhoused. It's a great honor to be here. At last, I've heard all about what's going on at the University of Austin, and so I feel very honored to be able to see it firsthand. 1 year ago, I flew from Los Angeles, where I live, to Detroit, rented a car, and drove an hour north to Flint, Michigan. I went to Flint to see how the city was doing a decade after it was consumed by the water crisis that left 12 people dead. The water crisis, as you may know, figured prominently in the 2016 Democratic primary, and now in October 2024, it was just 2 weeks before the presidential election, and it felt like the right moment to check in. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the downtown was mostly empty or boarded up. The only activity I could make out was a handful of cars outside the two strip clubs I passed by. Just outside downtown, there were these long blocks of compact, mostly wooden houses with one or two dilapidated cinder block steps outside, unkempt lawns, the occasional broken window. Beyond that were the emblems of the Flint that had once been. The classic American public high schools with the brick facades that had been shuttered and overtaken by graffiti and trash and weeds, the stately houses which were once occupied by senior managers at General Motors or corporate lawyers or surgeons and had been subdivided into group homes for addicts and old people. And of course, Buick City, which had been the epicenter of the global automotive industry and had been shut down decades ago, razed, turned into rubble and grassland. Everyone I interviewed was the son or daughter of someone who had once been part of that automotive industry. And the question that lodged itself in my head the moment I arrived, that the question I could never really answer was, why were they still there? They were still there, so far as I could tell, because of family or a lack of opportunity elsewhere, or most likely this inertia that was difficult for them to articulate and stop them from imagining life beyond Flint. Many worked in big box retailers or what was left of GM's Flint operations. Most had an entrepreneurial, hustler-like quality. They had stitched together any number of gigs, running a small babysitting or car washing business, Ubering, lifting, working a shift here or there at one of the convenience stores or gas stations on the interstate. There was, about most everyone I spoke with, a muted desperation, a wondering. That night, while having a burger and beer at some joint outside town, I was on the phone with my editor in New York, and she asked me what I made of Flint, and I had a hard time containing my anger. It was, I told her, a forgotten place, an unbelievably sad place. And then she recently recalled for me, I said that it felt like the sadness had been kneaded into the underbelly of the rusting carcass of this city that was no longer a city. I couldn't help thinking that the racial element, which Democrats had made a lot of noise about, was, well, sort of true. Flint, I saw now, had been left to rot because it was mostly black. The next morning, I jumped in my rental car and drove south and east 294 miles to the little town of East Palestine on Ohio's eastern flank. You may recall that in February 2023, 53 train cars that were part of a Norfolk Southern train containing huge vats of toxic chemicals derailed while barreling through East Palestine. The derailment, coupled with Norfolk Southern's subsequent controlled burn, which released this massive charcoal black mushroom cloud into the skies above East Palestine, led to this off-gassing of all the toxic chemicals into the floorboards and furniture and carpets in all the little banged-up wooden houses within a 1-mile radius of the railway tracks. It displaced thousands, and it shut down the last few remaining businesses that were still in East Palestine, and it turned this town, which was already struggling, into a very, very scary ghost town. The state's new junior senator, J.D. Vance, showed up soon after to pledge his support for East Palestine. Vance, unlike the journalists in D.C. and New York, knew how to pronounce the name of the place he was in, East Palestine, not East Palestine. A few days later, Donald Trump came to town. Trump, you may recall, was struggling to make his case to Republican voters at the time. Ron DeSantis was his number one rival for the 2024 nomination. The Florida governor had recently been reelected, and the Free Press had published a story about DeSantis Democrats. He seemed like a saner, more sober, more competent Trump. But then Trump showed up in East Palestine, and he bought all the first responders Big Macs, and he declared to all the people in this little broken town, "You are not forgotten." And right then and there, two things happened. The former president electrified his presidential bid, and he turned East Palestine into the symbol of the plight of the white working class. This place that had once been fully employed by the nearby steel factories and ceramics works, that had once played a major role in the economy of the country, the economy of the whole world. That was when it was bustling with schools and churches and diners and bowling leagues and VFW halls. That was when East Palestine mattered. It no longer really mattered. That night in my hotel room outside Pittsburgh, I had another long, winding conversation with my editor, who sometimes serves as a kind of therapist. And she asked me, predictably, "So how was East Palestine?" At which point I dove into an impassioned disquisition on East Palestine. I made a point self-righteously of correcting her pronunciation, and I explained why, even though I found so much about Trump loathsome, I understood in a way that I had not understood just 24 hours before why all these angry, alienated voters were voting for him, what it meant to be forgotten, the atomization, the loss of identity, the loss of structure and purpose, the awful casting about, again, this wondering. "I get why they hate Kamala," I said to her, "and it's not because she's black, it's because they're white, and they feel looked down upon, and they're seething with resentment, because for them, everything is not about freedom and joy." Freedom and joy, you may recall, were the two buzzwords that coursed through the short-lived terrorist campaign. They were meant to compensate for anything akin to an agenda. At which point my editor chimed in, "But I thought that was the story of Flint, just inverted." And then she said outrageously, "It feels a little convenient." The next morning I woke up feeling a tad sheepish. I am, after all, a journalist, which means I am supposed to maintain some semblance of objectivity. I am not supposed to deliver impassioned disquisitions. I am supposed to write dispassionate dispatches on the state of America, and I felt decidedly not dispassionate. I felt, with just a little hindsight, manipulated. I had slipped into the easy compartments that partisans in Washington, D.C. had concocted for me and countless other voters. I had allowed myself to believe that the story of Flint, like the story of East Palestine, was about race, which is what both parties prefer that we believe, because that story is easy to run on. It comes with built-in heroes and villains and reaffirms the assumptions of voters in both parties. And best of all, there is nothing that the politicians can do except bemoan other people's opinions, real or perceived. It does not importantly challenge us. Alas, I was not seeing the real story, which is the story that neither party wants to talk about, because neither party has any easy solutions, and because both parties in their own way are complicit in the status quo. No one wants to concede that places like Flint and East Palestine are not the result of racism, but impersonal sea changes that have swept the globe over the past 4 or 5 decades. Automation, the emergence of international labor markets, China's turn to capitalism, the decline of private sector unions, and so on. There are no obvious dragons to slay. There's no pat story that you can tell on the campaign trail. It's complicated. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here this evening not only to state the obvious, which is that life is, yes, often complicated, but to warn you against the manipulations of your political overlords, those who want your vote, your money, and most importantly, your identity. Those who construct easy compartments for you to slip into unthinkingly, flattering your egos, stoking your furies. I am here to argue that you have a duty, aesthetic, political, intellectual, and above all, moral, to maintain a political homelessness, or as a very impolitic friend back home in LA recently put it, to remain politically unhoused. In fact, I'll go further than that. I think that the only way out of our doldrums, the only way that we move past the wild fluctuations of our election cycles, the violence and the pyrotechnics, the illiberalism of right now, is for a critical mass of Americans to wrest themselves from the grip of both parties and to insist, as loudly and unequivocally as they can, that for any candidate to win their vote, they're going to have to dispense with the platitudes, the old categories, the old assumptions, the old racial coding, and come up with a seriously, intellectually coherent program. Policies backed up by ideas, backed up by values that comport with our founding values. Liberalism, pluralism, individualism. We do not want to live in a country run by hollowed-out, morally bankrupt institutions, and we do not want to live in a country run by would-be autocrats who feed off the angers generated by those inside the hollowed-out, morally bankrupt institutions. We want to live in a country that lives up to its own vision of itself. We want the most transformative culture, the most forward-looking ideas, the freest economy, the most competitive elections. We want to believe that in a few hundred years, human beings will recall that Americans are the people who overturned the historical default position, turning democracy and capitalism into the natural order of things, creating so much wealth that they were able to build the greatest universities and cure countless diseases and eliminate every last vestige of poverty and rescue the planet and colonize the solar system, that we expanded metabolically the way human beings actually imagine themselves, fulfilling the promise first articulated by the philosophers, historians, and poets of 5th century Athens. But before we dwell for too long on this utopian future, we should recall the not-so-distant past and how it is that we wound up at the very troubling crossroads we are now at. I don't know exactly when the crazy began, and anyone who says they do is a partisan, one of the many cogs in the Republican or Democratic firmament whose job is to make you believe that the other side is beyond the pale, a threat to the republic, a threat to your physical being. Republicans will insist it was the election of Joe Biden or Barack Obama or the very contentious 1987 Senate hearing for Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork. Democrats will counter that actually it was the stolen 2000 election of George W. Bush or January 6th, or more likely the 2016 election of Donald Trump, which has done more to dumb down the collective IQ of the Democratic Party than the most Machiavellian Republican strategists could ever have possibly dreamed of. It does not matter. These are all talking points that are meant to drive home the point that the other side is evil, and that before this one terrible thing happened, we inhabited this mythological prelapsarian reality that was never actually reality. To my mind, there have been foreshadowings of the great American crack-up of the early 21st century for decades or longer. The emergence in the 1950s of an American existential movement, the 1958 founding of the John Birch Society, the 1960 founding of Students for a Democratic Society, the 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy, the innumerable failures and omissions of the Warren Commission, the rise of Elvis, the rise of Haight-Ashbury, the 1967 publication of Jacques Derrida's terrible book of grammatology, the 1969 Manson murders, the 1971 end of the gold standard, the stagnation of working class wages, the publication of Arthur Danto's wonderful, troubling book, The Death of Art in 1984, the collapse of analog culture and the emergence of its digital doppelganger. They are all indications of tectonic changes, or they are the tectonic changes themselves for which our political class was wholly unprepared and has navigated with varying levels of ineptitude. The point is, We did not arrive here because of one or another terrible thing or mistake or misdeed. We are here in this moment because of a cavalcade of moments and decisions and phenomena, and no one in any position of power can prove otherwise. The point lurking behind that point is that since neither party can be mostly blamed for the polarization, the stratification, the decline in civic and intellectual life, neither party can be expected to rescue us from it. No doubt, Democratic and Republican partisans would find all this more than a little confusing. They have become so tribalized that they can no longer see beyond the contours of their own clan. This was vividly illustrated just last week when Donald Trump helped usher in an admittedly fragile ceasefire in Gaza. The same people who had been screaming that Gaza was literally worse than Auschwitz, the same people who insisted that we needed a ceasefire now, suddenly pivoted from that talking point to a new one, which was the fight goes on, or they were mute. Whatever the case, the cognitive dissonance of those Democratic partisans who could not conceive of a world in which Donald Trump was not the financier of genocide, but a democratically elected president who helped end a war was laughable. I should add that when I say partisans, I don't necessarily mean elected officials or their campaign aides, many of whom are far too cynical, too mercenary to be true partisans. I have in mind, for the most part, the great swarms of voters whose identity is inextricably bound up with their political opinions. Unfortunately for them, this blending or fusing of identity and political opinion blinds the partisans to all the contradiction and incongruity that cannot be fitted neatly into a stump speech or press release. It's not just that the partisans are blind to the good things that the other party does or the bad things that their own party is doing. The problem is deeper than that. It has to do with the partisan apprehension of reality, which is fantastical and warped and defined by a toddler-like moral bifurcation, which can be compared to a prism that very efficiently dispenses with any data or development or fact or argument that in any way undermines the narrative, and really is a labyrinth from which the partisan cannot escape. You do not want to wake up in a partisan labyrinth. Which is why, my friends, you must not align with either party. You must refuse the yoke of the partisan, and more importantly, since I suspect that many, if not most of you, are already disinclined to sign up with one or the other team, you must publicly, vociferously declare your nonpartisanship. You must popularize it. So, let's get to the heart of the matter. As noted, there are 4 arguments against aligning oneself with one of our 2 major parties. From the least important to the most important, they are 1, the aesthetic, 2, the political, 3, the intellectual, and 4, the moral. First, the aesthetic. Any of you who has spoken at length with diehard Democrats or Republicans knows how cognitively crippled they are. They cannot grasp the complexity of the human condition. They seem unaware that there is any complexity. They live in a black and white world in which everyone or everything is somehow good or bad, on the right side of history, whatever that means, or I suppose not. If I may be a tad uncharitable for a moment, the partisan is boring, and you should avoid boring at all costs. In fact, there's this wonderful park in Moscow called Niskuchny Sad, or Not Boring Park. You should aspire to spend your lives in the not boring park, real or metaphorical. Being not boring will mean a more fulfilling career and personal life, more interesting dinner parties, more interesting children, better books, more interesting movies and podcasts and art exhibits and vacations, more interesting everything. Second, the political. The last thing either party needs right now is a built-in constituency, a group of robots or lackeys who will support them no matter what. Much more helpful to individual voters and voting blocs, to the parties, to the nation, would be more competition. It is only by way of hard-fought elections in which the maximum number of voters are truly up for grabs that the parties will be forced to confront their illiberal tendencies, forge a broad coalition, and impose some modicum of order and direction on the political scene. Third, the intellectual. Neither party knows what it believes any longer. Both have largely abandoned their core principles. Both are searching for a telos. Let's start with the Democrats, the party that once upon a time was, in theory, for a benign collectivism meant to minimize economic disparity. That seems like another lifetime. I truly have no idea why Democrats exist today, other than to keep getting elected and reelected and to funnel money to their various core constituencies, public sector unions, activist organizations, lobbyists who are usually former electeds, and so forth. It looks like a pyramid scheme. Democrats say they exist to oppose Donald Trump, whatever he wants to do, which is stupid and, more to the point, false. They do things all the time to help Donald Trump, like nominate Zoran Mamdani or take ad hominem swipes at Charlie Kirk right after he's been murdered. Meanwhile, the Republicans, the party that used to support a robust individualism, now tell us that they are actually for the working man. But they're still figuring out what they mean by working man, and they seem not to have decided how much they want to balance the interests of the working man and consumers. Does that mean protecting, for example, white-collar workers at the expense of other people, other labor participants? Does it necessarily entail a new isolationism? Excuse me. If not, then what exactly is the difference between isolationism and America Firstism? And what about our vice president's obsession with this idea that America is not an idea, but a place? What are the implications of that? And it's not just about what the parties have not done, which is to articulate and execute on a clear agenda. It is also about what they have done, which is to make room for or openly embrace a new illiberalism, racial polarization, anti-Semitism, and a curtailing of our most basic civil liberties. In the case of the Democrats, we've seen this creeping corporatization of the party's culture over the past few decades, this narrowing of the discourse. This was best exemplified by the previous two presidential primaries. First, there was the truly risible spectacle of 2019-2020, in which several people who are supposedly adults and want to occupy the Oval Office agreed in front of the whole world that we should legalize illegal border crossings while taking a whack at the police and showcasing their pronouns. I don't know that that means that Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or Cory Booker or the rest of them actually believe in any of these things, but I do know that none of them had the fortitude to push back against the groupthink. They were all good lieutenants, good middle managers, which is very nice if you want to be a middle manager. Then there was the unnerving weekend at Bernie's disaster that was 2024, in which Democrats with their allies and legacy media shamelessly repeated the lie over and over and over that we all knew was a lie, which was that Joe Biden was not only fit to run for president, but be president until 2029. Importantly, what made all the make-believe possible was the gradual attitudinal shift among so-called liberals, who now tellingly call themselves progressives and find non-progressive opinion not only distasteful, but dangerous. In other words, the liberals have become illiberals. They are the opposite of what they once were. They are pathetic, and they pose a very real threat to the republic. In the case of the Republicans, we've seen the exact opposite process, a cracking open of the discourse. Suddenly, everything is up for debate, not just the usual stuff like tax policy or trade policy or whether we should build nations or just defend our own, but other very important things like, was Epstein really a Mossad agent? Or how do you know that 9/11 wasn't an inside job? Now, I suspect that many of the just asking questions set are really just asking questions in this reflexively, if not reflectively, anti-woke way. For however many years they've been told that they can't question progressive dogmas about race or gender or America or COVID or whatever, that if they do, they're a racist or a fascist or a white supremacist. And now they are doing just that, and they delight in flouting those orthodoxies. They've become trolls. That is the best that can be said of them. They just want to offend or hurt the libtards, which is, I guess, what one does if one has literally nothing else to do. But much, if not most, of the new right, and this includes many young Republicans, the future leaders of the party, as we recently discovered, is not interested in unearthing complex truths about anything serious or unserious. If they were, then presumably they would also welcome substantive engagement. They would welcome free expression, and they would be offended by the oversimplifications, the canards, the cartoonishness, and myth-making that have gripped large segments of the organized right. But they don't welcome free expression, and they are not offended by the myth-making. Consider the administration's lawfare or its crackdown on foreigners who say things it doesn't care for, or after Charlie Kirk's murder, the Attorney General's declaration of war on hate speech, which he was later forced to walk back, or the jawboning of ABC and the whole Jimmy Kimmel fiasco. Or recall that at Kirk's memorial last month, Tucker Carlson offered up an ancient anti-Semitic libel suggesting Jews were Christ killers with an eye toward pinning Kirk's murder on the Jewish state. Trump and J.D. Vance, who were both there, said nothing. In fact, the vice president tweeted to his 4.6 million followers after the memorial, "I think we did him proud." Carlson, of course, is hardly alone. He's competing with Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and more recently Megyn Kelly for Kirk's old audience, which is also the GOP base. A new irrationalism, a new fear and loathing has seeped up into the highest echelons of the American right and engulfed much of the rank and file. And while there are some who have admirably spoken up, I'm thinking of Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton in particular, most do not care or lack the cojones to do anything about it. All of which is to say, both major parties are untethered to any coherent worldview. They don't know what they stand for, which makes it unclear, to me at least, why anyone should stand with them. To be fair to the parties, we are in the midst of a deeper reimagining of our politics that has been building for a long time. I have written about this for the Free Press, and I've dubbed it the Great Scrambling. In short, the Great Scramble refers to a scrambling of the old political compartments to the extent that words like conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat no longer mean that much. Case in point, the lesbian trucker Shelley Lichty, who featured prominently in a story I reported in early 2024. I wrote about Shelley. She kind of cares about climate change, and she's pro-choice, and she's heartbroken about the people dying in Ukraine and Gaza, but she doesn't think it's America's problem, and she can't stand the kids in the LGBTQ plus movement with their, quote, 20 zillion acronyms, close quote. Shelley voted for Trump in 2016, but then she got sick of his antics, so she voted for Biden in 2020. But she doesn't really know what the Democrats stood for, but still she hated Trump, so she voted for Harris in 2024. But now she's up in the air. She's not independent the way that the media often refers to independence, which really means centrist, which really means lacking in any clear convictions. Shelley has very clear convictions. It's just that neither party represents all or even most of those. Neither party is her party. Now, the Great Scramble did not come out of a void. It, too, is reflective of an even deeper reimagining about the left and the right, which derive from the French Revolution, and about the nation-state, meaning the whole global order, which dates to the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. Bottom line, you cannot blame everything on the partisans. Both parties have been confused about what they are, what their raison d'etre is, for some time, and they will remain confused for the foreseeable future. It is our job as participants in the political marketplace to help steer both parties out of their confusion. Which brings us to the fourth and most important argument for being or remaining politically homeless, the moral, which flows naturally from the intellectual. If you believe that the Republic is the most just of all polities, and if you believe that a widespread political homelessness will prod both major parties into asking themselves what they believe, why they exist, and if you further believe that that auto-critique will bolster the stability and political health of the Republic, then you have a moral obligation to abandon your tribe or to remain tribeless. Now, two important caveats. One, there are, of course, office holders and office seekers who identify as Democrats or Republicans and, as far as politicians go, are good, basically honest, competent, committed to upholding the Constitution, making America more American, all that. I'll avoid naming names because the moment I praise any of the glorified used car salesmen who are temporarily in charge of the Republic, they will inevitably disappoint. The point is, you are allowed to vote for these Democrats and Republicans, but not because they are Democrats or Republicans. Two, I am not arguing for a permanent political homelessness. I am arguing for the necessity of a political homelessness right now. The two-party system has been crippled by market failure. Most voters, if the polls are to be believed, would like to vote for a particular kind of widget that our politics no longer manufactures, namely politicians who address seemingly intractable problems like the national debt and restoring the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. But once that failure has been corrected, assuming it is or can be, we shouldn't avoid some level of partisan adherence for the sake of avoiding it. After all, there is an obvious stabilizing value that comes from political parties with nationwide coalitions that provide politicians with voters, money, and a sense of direction or purpose. Indeed, one of the core problems that both parties face today, given that neither really knows what its purpose is all the freelancing. We want less freelancing, less platform surfing, less brand building. We want more cobbling together of large groups of disparate voting blocks around straightforward propositions like more guns, less butter, or more butter, fewer guns. I don't think we're ever going back to the coalition politics, the likes of which dominated America for most of the 20th century. That country is over. It has been eclipsed by one in which time has been collapsed. Place is mostly done with. Identity is constructed and raised and reimagined and constructed all over again. Objective reality is a point of view, and the present is sadly confusingly detached from the past and future. The core components of the American experience in the first half of the 21st century are radically different than they were just a half century or century ago, and the old coalitions and agendas no longer make much, if any, sense. It stands to reason that our politics will reflect those differences. But still, one can imagine a day when we emerge from our stupor, all the B- theater flickering across our screens, each flicker no more than a few seconds of highly titillating AI-generated video, and insist once again on a politics of predictability, which is to say a less consequential politics, a politics of roteness and rhythm and built-in inefficiencies that nonetheless make possible all of the freedoms that suddenly, unimaginably, feel uncertain, gelatinous. To get there, to return to a politics of predictability and seriousness and sobriety, a large number of young, educated Americans poised for leadership in one of our existing or emerging institutions is going to have to do something that many older Americans my age, have become uncomfortable doing: being an adult, growing up, shedding their adolescent predilections, accepting their mortality and all the awful, liberating implications that come with that. I have in mind naturally young Americans like you, those who have opted not to be excellent sheep, but to take possession of their education. You are where the long, difficult tunneling out of the dark must start. You will do this, I hope, by embracing your political homelessness, by helping to popularize that homelessness, by celebrating your independence, and by flouting the clannishness, the signaling, the performative idiocy that has come to define and dominate so much of what passes for political discourse in the United States in the third decade of the 21st century. You will inevitably antagonize friends and family and colleagues, those who insist your homelessness is a pose, a veil, stupid, myopic, immoral, whatever. You will come in for loads of scorn from the partisans. They will be surprised that you, with all the books you've read and the fascinating places you visited, don't vote the way they vote 100% of the time. You may even limit your professional and personal prospects. But you're made of tougher stuff than that. You have already announced to the world that you could not care less about playing their game. Do not play the red, blue, Republican, Democrat game. It is a tragicomedy and a farce. I want to end, by stating what seems to me like something that is obvious and all-important, but most of our political actors and the media who cover them seem to have forgotten. There is such a thing in the universe as moral facts. We can argue about one's ethics, one's philosophy of the good. Are you a Kantian, a utilitarian, an intuitionist, and a motivist? I'm less interested for now in how you arrive at moral facts than the fact of moral facts, their existence. It is a good thing, for example, to walk an old lady across a busy street. It is a bad thing to walk her halfway across the street. It is wrong to shoot a man in the neck for exercising his First Amendment rights. It is also wrong to shoot a man in the back for doing a perfectly legal job that you happen to find objectionable, and so on. I say all this because we live in an age in which moral facts feel weirdly quaint. And I fear that young Americans have been persuaded that they no longer really exist. I fear that young Americans have been sold a bill of goods by the politicians, which is this: to be good is to be guilty. Decency is complicity. That is a lie meant only to rationalize bad behavior, which in and of itself accomplishes nothing and actually does great harm. In fact, it is meant to ensure that we remain locked in our partisan compartments. Recall that just a few election cycles ago in 2008, John McCain, the Republican nominee for President of the United States, when told by one of his supporters that she did not like Barack Obama because he was an Arab, shook his head and replied, "No, ma'am, he's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with." One is free to disagree with McCain about pretty much everything: campaign finance, the Iraq War, Sarah Palin, even Barack Obama, who is more complicated than McCain would have had us believe. But on this point, we should be crystal clear. Refusing to pile on Obama because his middle name is Hussein did not make McCain politically correct. If you believe that, then you have been co-opted by the woke right. It made him decent. It reminded Americans what our elections are meant to be about. And even if they are often about other things, it doesn't mean they have to be that way. It reminded them that there is such a thing as moral facts. Our political class has, for the most part, jettisoned, or more charitably, forgotten that there are moral facts. And the subtext of that forgetting, the subtext of the past decade of American political life has been, if you don't dispense with the old norms, the old niceties, if you don't shatter all that, you are somehow guilty of everything the so-called populists on the right or left blame on the so-called establishment: economic stratification, forever wars, identity politics. You have to be a jackass, in other words, to prove that you can be trusted. Your mean-spiritedness is actually a badge of honor, while your adherence to the old code is a sign that your loyalties are misplaced. Decency is complicity. Please. That is the logic of an ill-tempered child or an opportunist. It is divisive and counterproductive, and it encourages the very worst in all of us. It is easy to lose sight of all this because we are in the midst of a protracted postmodern moment, unmoored as it is from fact and reason. We forget that until not very long ago, we took for granted a certain civilizational bedrock and all the assumptions about the nature of reality, education, the republic, the obvious moral superiority of that republic built into the bedrock. But now the vulgarians, the illiberal faction, the grifters, the frauds, the partisans are breaking through the front door, the back door. They are climbing through the windows and up the latticework all the way to the chimney. They are taking over the old ramshackle neo-colonial manor that is the republic, and they are deconstructing it, collapsing it, making it dumber, cruder, crasser, more vulnerable than ever before to the barbarian horde. It remains to be seen whether we are only in the first few decades of a very long decline or whether we can reclaim our bearings. That decision is being made right now by many, many people across the country, across the Anglosphere, across Europe. It is taking place in polling booths, on campus, on social media, in the new media landscape, and it is reflected in any number of micro decisions about the culture, the discourse, our politics. And my hope is that by rejecting the old partisan institutions, just as you have rejected the old institutions of higher education, you will help force a recalibration, a starting over. You will play some small but essential role in restoring not only civil discourse, but moral facts and objective reality. You will help cultivate and grow the chorus of Americans who insist on overthrowing the crazy, rejecting the stupid and grotesque, and restoring some semblance of normalcy to a republic in dire need of it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, how does your suggestion to remain politically homeless comport with what does seem to be a winning strategy right now, which is to trust the plan but always chimp out? How could a voter have any claim on their party if they relegate themselves to only ever being takers of baskets of positions?
Sorry, you're saying how do you force the parties to do anything for you if they can't count on you voting for them?
Yes.
I would turn that upside down and say, how do you get the parties to do anything for you if they know that they don't have to do anything to keep you, or very little, right? This has been Republicans' argument, I think, correct, for a long time about Black Americans, right? So they until Trump, there had been very little movement when it came to voting trends in the Black community. What that meant is that Democrats didn't have to do anything and Republicans didn't have to bother. So I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding, but that's.
Isn't it just intuitively much easier for reasonable discussion to be had within a party instead of between or across the aisle, and real changes in position to happen?
That's an interesting proposition. I don't think so. I don't think that recent history suggests as much. I think that what office seekers respond to more than anything else, they have a kind of rodent-like sensibility when it comes to like the public zeitgeist and where people are headed. And when they know that they can count on large, chunks of the electorate voting a particular way, they tune them out. They stop talking to them or thinking about them or engaging with them in any substantive way. So all the conversation, all the energy, all the imagination is funneled into the handful of voters who, can't make up their minds the day before the election. And a lot of this, I think, a lot of the strategy goes all the way back. I think it may have been before, but really it's Karl Rove in 2000 who was the one who pioneered this idea of kind of going deep as opposed to broad. But anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Sure.
So in your initial stories about Flint and East Palestine, you said that people are often unwilling to talk about the real enemies of China, an emerging international labor market, a lack of private sector unions, and instead we've chosen the easy enemy, which is race. But it's not clear or intuitive to me. I mean, we have a very complicated history with race, and a very complicated understanding of race. So why is it that often identity characteristics are the easier target?
You mean why is it that the default position is to talk about race as opposed to these kind of like amorphous forces that I was referring to?
Yes.
For that reason, because it's easy because politicians get elected by tapping into your feelings, not by reasoning with you. So no one gets elected by saying, look, we've had this very, interesting development over the past, 5 or 6 decades since the end of the war. The expansion of labor markets and what the Chinese have done, the Vietnamese, and what's happening now in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a testament to our success, but of course it doesn't feel like that because that's not how you win. You win by isolating, by finding who your bad guy is and your good guy. And the good guy, of course, is always the voters, the people you're trying to get to vote for you. And the bad guy is the people who are not going to vote for you no matter what, or the politicians who you're running against. And so it's concocted, right? It's convenient, and it's a script, and it gets played over and over and over. And I think, look, to be fair, I think there's often some elements, some shadings of race or identity that get factored into these conversations or these deliberations, these developments. But I don't think that's the core problem. The core problem, is that places like Flint and East Palestine no longer make stuff that the world wants to buy. And if they don't do that, then they get forgotten. It has nothing to do with anyone in Washington or anyone in any position of power saying, I don't like you because of your skin color. It's just that you're not doing anything for me or anyone else that I want to spend money on.
Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of people blindly following a political party,
Yeah.
how much of that issue do you think is caused by campaign finance, where individuals or corporations can donate massively larger amounts to the party itself than to an individual?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I don't think that's. I hadn't considered that too much. I mean, you're talking about the super PACs now and the world kind of post Citizens United, which is obviously has like changed the landscape, but I don't think it changes the underlying dynamics. Look, the problems have been intensifying for 2, 3, 4 decades. I mean, it really goes all the way back to the end of the Cold War and the election in 1992 of Bill Clinton, and at least, if not earlier, in terms of just like when you see this overt kind of like partisanization of our politics to the point that people start saying things. The first time I recall anyone ever saying, so-and-so is not my president is the 90s with Republicans saying, Bill Clinton is not my president. Well, he is your president. You just didn't vote for him. Or now Democrats, I was at a dinner party a few nights ago and a very nice person there who just said, Donald Trump is not my president. And he actually is your president. You just hate him. But that's why we have elections, and you get to vote for whoever runs against him next time. So stop with this. Like again, it's toddler-like sort of thinking. He is your president. You don't like the reality. It doesn't make it. You can't make it go away. You have to engage with it. So I think to your question with regard to like financing and super PACs and the parties versus individual candidates, I don't think that has affected dramatically sort of the underlying kind of partisan dynamic, which has been building for a long time, and then just structural changes in campaign finance.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, it seems like there's an obvious argument of don't let yourself be captured, don't let yourself be defined by some group, and basically be an individual, right? Think for yourself.
Right.
That's an obvious argument. You seem to be saying more than that. Not just think for yourself, not just, be a centrist or whatever, but be non-partisan, be politically homeless. So when I hear you talk about that these parties are not working, it seems like the reason why you're not partisan is that they're not working, and we have a system based on cooperation, based on forming parties. If that's not working, and that seems like the system is not working, so what would you say? What could your argument possibly be, other than it's broken? Sorry, this is a really inarticulate question, but it's kind of troubling. Like, what do you say to the person who listens to this and kind of reads between the lines that, like, what else are we doing in politics? Yeah, I'm sorry.
The good news, it's okay. The good news is that this is all the system, right? The system is not just, sort of organized elections or politicking. It's the conversation that takes place. It's the media. It's what we read and talk about. It's how we think about these things. It's what goes on campus. That's all the system in a free society. And so a talk like this is part of the system, and it's somebody, in this case me, arguing for a reassessment of our hyper-partisan moment. And I think, look, at the very least, if a handful of you leave here tonight thinking, maybe it's not wise to vote all the time for one party or the other, then that's a good thing, because we are making it that much harder. I have made it that much harder then for either party to win, and that means they have to work harder. They have to think a little more expansively. They have to nominate better people. One of the reasons we keep nominating really subpar people to run, and it's now gotten to the point where they're actually, I think, traditionally, I think the way it had worked was the people who run for office and win are right at the median. They're right where like the middle of America is. That's how they win. They might be a little bit smarter when it comes to speaking, and they might be a little bit more elastic when it comes to their morals. You have to lie, but they're basically where America is. And I think we've gotten to a point now where I think large numbers of Americans look at the people on the political dais or on the political stage, and they think those people are lesser. We're somehow now electing people who are worse than most Americans. They're not representative of us. They're somehow the very worst of us. Now, they've always been, to some degree, as I said, a little bit tainted, but they're really tainted now. And so I think the way that things get better is this is the system. This is all part of the system. And so I think this is a good thing. You being here is a good thing. This whole conversation is a good thing. And my hope is that this replicates itself and people have more conversations like this all around the country.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I can understand why the complicated cavalcade of events is the source of the divisive current moment. But I can't quite see where the pressure pushing any person to being a partisan comes from, and why it's something that can be stopped. If no one's actually suffering any kind of oppression from the other partisan, then what's driving the shift towards partisanship increasingly in everyone? And why is that a force that can be combated?
So I think you're saying, if I understand you correctly, why are more people, why are they identifying so strongly with their political opinions?
Yeah, it's a kind of simple question.
No, it's in many ways the question. A lot has been written about this and talked about this. For one thing, they have much less. There are far fewer other things with which they can identify. Right? I mean, Americans are in this very sad, frightening place right now where they are casting about constantly in search of an identity. Right? I mean, what is the whole? The whole argument over race and gender and the sort of up and down of trans identification or non-binary identification, so much of that is about Americans in search of something to latch onto and to give themselves a sense of rootedness and meaning. Look, I think that people have, succumbed to, their political beliefs because they're not throwing themselves into other things that are much, much more enduring and important, that make the politics look like what they really are, which is theater, very expensive theater put on by those seeking power, either office seekers or their financial backers. But that has nothing to do with real, meaning with anything that gives you anything enduring, whether we're talking about faith or family or community or professional achievement or country or anything bigger than yourself. I think so much of that has been eroded or stripped away that, yes, Americans increasingly, see in their political beliefs something much bigger than is actually there, which makes it all the more pathetic, right? It doesn't actually matter that much if you, XYZ person, feels that strongly about how someone voted about this one thing. It's interesting, and you have maybe a good argument and a point of view, and that should be discussed. But literally nothing rises or falls on that. On the other hand, the quality of father or mother, daughter, son, whatever matters immensely. The kind of human being you are, the kind of American you are, the reading, the studying, the sort of intellectual input that you digest, all that matters vastly more than your opinion about whatever people are upset about right now on X.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hello.
Hi.
One advantage to participating in political philosophy is that it doesn't force you to make political decisions right away. You have the opportunity to think about what you'll do eventually, and then the moment you decide to go to to a protest or lobby for someone, you've made your political decision, and then you've stopped the political philosophizing process. Do you agree with that? And if so, at what point do you stop thinking about what the right action is and just decide on what your political belief is?
You mean when does thinking give way to action or decision making?
Right. When you sort of cede your participation in political philosophy in exchange for actually doing something political?
So when does that or when should that happen?
When should you do that? It's on the basis of stopping to philosophize and starting to act prevents you from philosophizing as well in the future.
I guess, I mean, look, I think one of the advantages of studying political philosophy is that it should give all of us a sense of perspective. And it should make all of us ideally a little bit less political in the sense that I guess I was just discussing a moment ago. We should care a little bit less about incremental decisions, actions, developments, elections, and think more about the fundamental things. We should participate. We should vote. We should read and engage and all that. But what we should stop with the confusing, the blending of identity and opinion, or identity and political opinion. So I'm not sure if there's any point at which like we stop thinking or philosophizing and then start. I think I'm understanding you correctly, and then start, like doing, like taking part in political. I guess I think you mean like making a decision, like aligning with one camp or another. Like, I mean, I guess you could be philosophizing up until you get into the ballot box, or like, having a conversation with yourself. I think that like the most important thing is to think critically always. And, I'm kind of leery of like protests in general and like any kind of like mass movement, because that means a surrender of, or a sacrificing of, kind of reflection in the service of kind of something mass, some kind of large group activity. There's sometimes value in that, but for the most part, it's a kind of a, I don't think it achieves very much. And more to the point, I think it amounts to a kind of suspension of reflection as opposed to what is needed most of all, which is reflection, critical reflection.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hi, really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering whether the downward sort of decline of political discourse could be attributed more to the actions of political parties or some sort of social decline.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I tend to think it's actually more the latter than the former. I think you can, and I think we have to address the sort of the sort of more fundamental problem about what the hell is happening to us on multiple fronts. I'm addressing it tonight. I was focusing on the parties, but I think, look, politics, to use a stupid cliche that comes up often in political journalism, is downstream of culture, and there's no doubt that what is going on here and at other campuses across the country will impact on, in a very concrete way, our political life, for better or, I fear, for worse. I don't have in mind Austin as much as just everywhere else. But I think that, look, if you want to address those other kind of the more intractable problems, the deeper, more fundamental problems, that has to do with education. It has to do with really it's education. I think above all, to a lesser degree, but very important one. I think media is important. But I mean, look, I think we need young people reading better books, reading more. We need to, I think, reimagine or rethink our relationship with technology in a very, very profound way. There are a lot of things that have to happen that have nothing to do, strictly speaking, with our political life, all of which bear directly on that political life. So I think what you've touched on is very important, and the parties obviously have nothing to do with that. So yeah, that's another angle of the same conundrum.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
What do you think should be the core values that are embodied by the restored republic?
The ones, I mean, I'm not making anything up here. I mean, there's the ones I enumerated. I mean, you have pluralism, liberalism, and individualism, which are, I think, adequately vague, but also defined to make for, the kind of the perfect or the right, kind of structure or superstructure within which the democracy, the republic, I should say, can operate. So we need to be asking ourselves, with regard to every single candidate, every election, how does this candidate perform, sound, look when it comes to those three values? Do I believe that this person, let's take the case or take the value of pluralism, do I think this person is really not only open to, other viewpoints? I don't know that politicians actually think like that, but capable of integrating other ideas in his or her head. Can this person, see sort of the complexity of questions, issues? And there are some candidates where I think when they're smart and they're thoughtful, they're able to communicate that. But we should be demanding that of them. We should be. I mean, I think the best question always to ask candidates is, tell me one thing that the other party is getting right that your party is getting wrong. And it can't be some sort of nonsensical, stupid response. I don't know, but I mean, like, politicians also are superb at coming up with that. It's got to be something real. So I think there are politicians like that. There are electeds who I think have done that. The last president we had, who I think really was able to sort of integrate competing vantage points, really, and this is a long time now, is George H.W. Bush. So we're going back to when I was in high school and college. So it's a long time, but I think that's the first thing. Then, so I would just be thinking of those three values and assessing candidates on the basis of those three values.
Could you elaborate a little more what those look like practically?
Yeah, so like pluralism, the ability, I would think, to like integrate into your head like sort of competing vantage points. Liberalism, are you really committed to civil liberties? Are you really committed to Americans speaking, thinking expansively, freely? Are you couching your support for the First Amendment in kind of pretty happy talk that to me sounds rather dangerous? I don't want to hear about unsafe opinions or trigger warnings or anything like that. I want a robust defense of our civil liberties for any number of reasons. Number one is that all progress stems from a robust exercise of our civil liberties. Every single good thing that has happened in this country has happened as a result of a robust exercise of our civil liberties. So simply for that reason alone, so I want to know that they are really, really committed to that. And then when it comes to individualism, I want to know that you think in terms of individual Americans. It's fine and well to talk about these abstractions, the working class or our elites, but that's such a convenient crutch. It's such a stupid crutch, because no one actually knows what that means. I say an elite. What is that? Who is that? Like, what is that? Or the working class. I heard that. I was at the 2024 GOP convention in Milwaukee, and the number of times that elite or working class was spoken from the stage was, I mean, every speech was kind of riddled with that. I have no idea, and nor do the speakers know what that means. So I think it's fine to have like some of those ideas in your head, but I want to know how you're thinking in terms of individuals. How is this actually affecting real people and not cartoon cutouts who comport with some politicized idea of what you think America is?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So I do have a question, but I'm going to have to ask you to take a mental walk with me for a second.
Okay. Let's go on the walk.
All right.
Is it a
Imagine
long
this.
walk?
No, it's a short walk. Trust. Imagine this. You're debating our very own Yale Abernathy, and you're getting crushed.
I'm sorry, I'm debating whom?
Yale. It's one of our students. He's one of our students here.
Oh, okay.
Just imagine a really good-looking guy. Okay.
Okay.
So imagine you're debating this guy, right? And you're absolutely getting crushed. Debate's over.
I'm getting crushed.
Yes.
Okay. Totally possible, yeah.
Debate's over. You go home. You feel pretty bad about it, but you're unconvinced, as most people are after they have a debate. Now imagine another scenario. Imagine you have like a little voice in your head that tells you to do something. It's just telling you to do these things, and you're like, okay, I'm going to do it. It's probably your own voice, you think. And you just feel it, and you go for it, and you just have no objections to it. Now, let's take a look at the parties. If you have a group of people, and they're all very well determined, and they take this method, right? It's almost as if the party is changing subtly, subconsciously, without anyone on the outside seemingly doing anything. Wouldn't this be better than if someone was trying to externally attack this party, tell you, hey, you need to do this. It should be like this. Logically, I'm better like this. Wouldn't it be better if we as the people, as a group, went into the party, say, the most susceptible party, the one that seems to be the easiest to change, to get it to where we want without people like really thinking about it or noticing. It's just one day it's here, and then the next it's here where we want it.
No, I'm sorry. So I think so what's the...
The biggest point is that we are changing it subtly from the inside rather than trying to fight it from the outside.
So okay. So okay, that's a very, very good question. So you mean, I think if I understand what you're saying, please tell me if I'm misconstruing your question. I think you're saying, isn't it better to try to reform from within than to leave and then to insist on change from the outside?
Yes. I want to add this caveat that it's this subtle change, like this voice in your head, rather than something that you think about and fight logically.
I'm not sure that the difference there is much, but I think that I think here's the problem, and this is why I stress this in my talk. I think that there is a difference between voting reliably for a certain party, cutting checks for certain candidates from a certain party, and feeling like you are that party, right? So it's like the dinner party I described earlier. The people at the dinner party cannot imagine themselves being anything other than progressive. That is who they are. That's because I live in Los Angeles. But they cannot fathom themselves outside of that kind of intellectual. That's not really the right word, but that outside of like sort of that idea. That's their identity. That's who they are in the same way that it's to their core. That's the problem. It's not whether they. I guess it. So when I'm approaching this less from like a structural point of view is, well, can't you affect change more if you're on the inside versus the outside? I think it's more that Americans have to think differently about these things so that they do force the parties to behave differently or to operate differently. And I don't think that by being a loyal Democrat or a loyal Republican, you achieve that change. Now, I may not be appreciating the difference between the kind of the granular change you were talking about and the kind of bigger change. Maybe that's not the right way of framing it, but what seems patently clear to me, just having covered a lot of races, is that the office seekers, office holders, they know who their partisan base is, and those are the people they don't ever talk to or worry about. I mean, the rule of thumb is, right, when somebody has given you their vote, you walk away. It's like, great, nice to see you. I want them engaging with voters constantly. I want them being forced to justify themselves. And I don't know that. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think, does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're worried about the party being the identity of people, right? But I'm saying people have to engage inside of that party if that party will take on their identity.
No, it doesn't. The party isn't. A party is. I mean, to be really crass. I mean, I said used car salesman earlier. It could just be prostitutes. I mean, the party is full. That's the kind of like that's the way the parties work. And I don't mean that to. I mean, no. I don't mean to disparage sex workers. It's just like that's what the party is. The party is a chameleon. It's chameleons. Like they. What do you want me to be? I'll be that. What I mean that like what we saw, the kind of tidal shift among Republicans post-Trump is unbelievable, right? Because if you think about it, like prior to Trump, the model Republican was closer to, think about who the party nominated just the previous cycle. They were exemplars of kind of Reagan Republicanism, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. I mean, they are kind of they represent a certain ethic, a certain way of thinking and doing politics. And the moment that the politicians saw that that doesn't win anymore, they just left it. They rejected it. I don't know what that's about. Like they changed. And this includes, I think, people who are, often, very smart and thoughtful. Well, I'm not sure about thoughtful, but smart. Who they see where the changes are happening and they migrate accordingly. So I'm not sure if that again answers your question, but I guess my point is the parties are very, very adaptable, and so it's the onus is on voters to force them to adapt to something better.
Hi, Peter. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm really grateful for a lot of what you said. I share a lot of your views. The question I wanted to ask you was, considering what a progressive mayor like Michelle Wu has achieved in Boston, considering what Barack Obama achieved in America, why must the Zoran Mamdani candidacy be such a gift to the Trump administration?
I think there's a profound difference between Mamdani and I don't know enough about Wu, but certainly Obama. Obama in the end ran on a kind of like a vaguely leftish populist program that he, basically abandoned in the service of a kind of very kind of milquetoast, middle of the road politics that I think, left him in the end with a kind of, I think at best, like a C+ record. Mamdani is, as far as I can tell, consumed by a sort of this, the kind of the worst of the old left and the worst of the new left. So there's the old left politics, the sort of Bernie politics, the economic determinism, which, the free bus rides and all that. So we'll see how expensive New York is in a year from now, or like what the state of the subways are, when or the buses are when you no longer have to pay to ride on them. Okay, that's going to be an awful experiment, but New York will experience it. They've been there before. But then also that's coupled with the sort of identity politics that has co-opted most of the kind of organized left. So, and now the right too, but in different ways. So I think, I guess I see Mamdani as just I think he's going to be this wonderful gift to the Republican Party. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that he succeeds brilliantly and is forced to temper some of his wilder ideas, and all the people who were fretting about him were dead wrong. Of course, if he's elected mayor, we want him to succeed. Because as I was saying earlier, even if you didn't vote for him, he's going to be your mayor, and we want the city, America's biggest city, to succeed. I don't think it will, and I think that will be I think that will be very, very useful. I think every dumb idea they come up with will just be an ad, and it will play very, very well in all the precincts and congressional districts where Republicans, all the purple, battleground areas where Republicans need to win.
Maybe he'll pivot and wise up.
Entirely possible. My fear of with regard to Mamdani is deeper. I think he's sort of the antithesis to sort of my idea of what the typical sort of University of Austin student is. He seems to me like a caricature of sort of the modern kind of corporate progressive / socialist kind of student / post student of sort of elite America, whatever we mean by elite America. There's his cadence, his vernacular, the sort of set of ideas that are wonderfully sort of fantastical, and to the point that they're silly. He seems to be untethered from any kind of economic reality. It's unbelievable to me that a city with so many serious, smart, successful people is about to elect this person, but then again, it's also an indictment, of course, of the sort of the sclerotic, democratic, party, especially in the city and in New York, and maybe it will serve some good in that respect as well.
Well, I'm getting to have dinner with you, so I will debate the rest of this point then. It does seem to be in the spirit of your talk. If we have to accustom ourselves to a presidency by someone who also had no political experience, whose agenda often has moved around no less than somebody's like Mamdani, which actually has not, perhaps we should leave ourselves more open to the possibility.
I like the spirit. I like the spirit, of course, and you're right. Look, Mamdani has embraced, is a very Trump-like character in some respects. So there is this kind of, like his proposals are silly in the same way that building a wall that Mexico is going to finance is silly. So maybe you're right in that regard. My sense with like Trump is that he was conscious of the silliness. He was aware of how inane all this was. It was just good theater that got voters excited. In the case of Mamdani, I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that he actually believes it. That he thinks that no, we are going to do this, and this is the future. That's not going to be the future.
I want to cede the floor, but to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask an entirely different question, but now I'm intrigued. Do you think that the inverse is true, where now that the Republican Party controls presidential seat, House, Senate, and the Supreme Court, that if conservative policy does not sort of create, if conservative policy given effectively absolute rule over the American political system, if that does not show significant increase in living conditions in America or in the general attitude of Americans, would that be considered the greatest gift for Democrats in the way that Mamdani would be a gift for Republicans?
Right. I mean, just given that Republicans have so much power right now.
Yeah, it would be kind of hard to blame, in more divided America, like the other party can blame the other party for your problems, but Republicans can't really blame Democrats for national problems anymore, I think.
They can't, but of course our politics have become nationalized for a number of reasons, the death of local media, the rise of social media, and so forth. So some inane thing that some Democrat does on some city council in Peoria suddenly is a national story that is, Nancy Pelosi or Hakeem Jeffries' problem, which is stupid, but is nonetheless true. I guess you could say that case, and that's certainly, you could say that, and that's certainly what Democrats will say next year when they run, in the midterms. Everything, is a really, the assumption is that is basically just sort of a vote on how well is Donald Trump performing, or how well has he sold whatever he's doing to the American people. We'll see. I think that, and I think Democrats will do. Right now, it's hard to say. The Democrats are in the midst themselves of figuring out, like the Republicans, what they want to be, but they're in a much, much earlier stage. So, you're seeing sort of this rising crop of kind of like next gen Bernie bros who are challenging or cropping up in Senate and House races. The kind of presidential analog would be AOC, I imagine. But for now, I think those candidates don't have a lot of currency. So they're not like Trump in 2016, who really captured the Republican energy. Anyone who was watching that race early on in the fall of 2015 knew that Trump was going to win this. They loved him, and there's no one. You don't see a similar kind of parallel sort of enthusiasm around even national figures like an AOC. She certainly has her base, but she's very, very divisive in a way that Trump within the Republican Party was not divisive. So anyway, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but
thank you.
Sure.
How are we supposed to go about attacking illiberalism in a liberal, respectful, decent way?
That's a great question. Well, I think things like this. I think appealing as much as possible to thought and argument as opposed to feeling. I think bearing in mind always those three core values: pluralism, liberalism, individualism, these kind of founding values of the Republic. I think that, I think more than anything, intellectual modesty, bearing in mind that there is nobody who has a monopoly on the truth or on what works. I think that the moment that you decouple identity from opinion, you enable yourself to have much more fruitful, meaningful conversation. So if you are the kind of person who like tears up when talking about kids in cages, at the border, it is a very troubling, very, very complicated problem. But you have to be an idiot or a partisan to think that this just started with Donald Trump. It didn't. Or that somehow he's the sole villain. Or conversely, if you're getting all worked up about, I'm trying to think about like any number of dumb things that Republicans have said recently. Nothing's coming to mind, but there are plenty. Trust me. If you're swayed by these things, if emotionally, then you've lost the plot. You're no longer in control of yourself. So I think that's how you engage, in a civil way, right? You reclaim yourself in a way, and you say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to be steered by my feelings. People. I've never had a constructive conversation about politics with anyone who says, like, this is very personal for me. Like, my response to that is always, like, then maybe we shouldn't be talking about it. It's like, I don't want to talk about, like the conversation you had with your doctor about like a bad diagnosis. That's not my business. Or like, you were in therapy with your wife or, husband. Like, okay, I'm glad that you guys are getting help, but that's not something you want to share with me. Similarly, if we can't talk about the war in Ukraine in a way that doesn't involve you ranting and raving, but just you in the general sense, then there's no conversation to be had, and we're not getting anywhere. So I think I would start with that. And I think that's got to be a kind of a baseline sort of expectation.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech. I really enjoyed both just how it was excellently written and like the way you read it, the timbre of your voice. You explained that there is like earnest inquisition, but also you used people on the right as examples of people who are maybe a bit reactionary. Mm-hmm. And I also, disagree with plenty of things being said right now. I wanted to inquire as to your advice about how specifically to distinguish between like good faith, good nonpartisan inquisition and reactionary speech that maybe should awaken skepticism.
So the difference between good faith and bad faith engagement.
Yeah.
I think that that's not always so easy, especially if you're dealing with, well, no, actually I take that back. It's not so easy if you're dealing with like political professionals, consultants, campaign, higher ups who specialize in, they don't specialize in anything akin to the truth. They specialize in narrative production, which is to say, mythology or lie production. But for most people, your run-of-the-mill partisan whose identity is bound up with his or her opinions, I think you can unpack that pretty quickly. I think I'm answering your question. I think you can figure out pretty quickly. And I think people are usually pretty forthright about do you really believe this or not. So am I saying, or am I getting that right? Or
kind of. I think what I'm curious about is how we distinguish between the kinds of speech you used as bad examples on the right and like the kind of earnest inquisition that we as good
you mean like just
nonpartisans
asking questions, people?
Yeah.
Right. So I think that if you are relying on unverifiable statements, if you are believing things that you want to believe, but you can't actually substantiate, if you are resorting to conspiracy theorizing, which is what has consumed really both parties, but now it is really pronounced, especially on the right, the sort of feverish tunneling or looking for, like the conspiracy theory, like what is really going on, like peeling back this onion that, the many layers that can never be peeled enough. We're always being lied to. We're always being sold a bill of goods. That's just not true. And I think I think the question for people like that who the just asking questions people is, what would satisfy you? At what point do you stop blaming abstractions like the deep state for, the reason your water bill was so expensive last month? Like, when does that happen? Like, what answer is going to satisfy you? And I think what you usually always encounter with these people is nothing. Nothing will satisfy them. Like, nothing is ever going to, get to a point where they say, "Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I should have thought about that. But no, I appreciate you mentioning that. Okay, now we're good." It's never that. It's always going to be, well, that's what you think. Well, I think that because a lot of people think it, and it was written down, and there were people who testified as much, and there are facts that substantiate the point I just made. That's why I think it. So I think there's a with the just asking questions people, there is this. I think there is a legitimate desire on the part of a lot of them to ask questions that were considered off limits for a long time. And a lot of those questions should have been asked, right? So like the origins of COVID, right? So we were supposed to think that, the lab leak was racist, but the eating a bat was not. I will never understand that. But, okay, so you couldn't really ask that question of like, well, where did COVID come from? Okay, but then I guess it's a matter of judgment, right? So we all know, sort of common sense dictates that, we should be able to ask questions about that. I think that if we have a hard time distinguishing with kind of commonsensical judgments, and we really have seen this death of, or decline, I should say, of common sense in America, it's a very serious problem. Then we get to a place where we can't make these sort of again commonsensical distinctions. So I think that is Jeffrey Epstein and all the people who went to his island to sleep with underage girls, is he unethical? Absolutely. Is he part of an international cabal or conspiracy that's secretly running governments everywhere? No. Of course not, because they don't care. Where is the proof? You can always stitch together things it's like looking at the night sky. You can stitch together sort of make-believe constellations if you choose to, or you can obey Occam's razor and say, well, that doesn't really make any sense. And so there's really no reason for now to believe that. If contradictory or complicating evidence surfaces, then we can reassess. But until then, no.
Okay, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.